Fake lawyer. The words dropped like a gavel slammed against marble, sharp and dismissive, slicing through the air of the chamber. For a moment, time seemed to fracture. Conversations froze mid-sentence. Heads turned. You could almost hear the oxygen leave the room. Richard Posner had spoken, and with that one phrase, he wasn't just questioning Jasmine Crockett's credentials. He was attempting to erase her very existence as a lawyer, as a fighter, as a woman who had clawed her way into rooms where people like him had never wanted her to be. Gasps rippled across the crowd, some muffled, some audible. A few hands flew to mouths. Others shifted uncomfortably in their seats, unsure whether to laugh, to glare, or to hide. Cameras clicked faster. Journalists leaned forward, and the spotlight, whether Posner intended it or not, swung directly onto Jasmine. There she sat, calm, poised, her eyes narrowing ever so slightly. She didn't flinch. She didn't fumble with papers or stammer in protest. She simply let the insult hang in the air, suspended like smoke, until the weight of Posner's arrogance became clear to everyone present. Fake lawyer. 2 words that revealed more about him than they ever could about her. Because behind the insult was a sneer, an unspoken assumption that titles and pedigree mattered more than courtroom victories, more than service, more than the lived fight for justice. It was the arrogance of an old guard, the belief that authority itself could silence truth. But in that silence, as every eye watched Jasmine, something else began to stir. The sense that this was no ordinary moment, no ordinary insult, and no ordinary woman being insulted. The chamber's energy shifted. The crowd leaned in, sensing a storm on the horizon. Was she going to explode? Was she going to fire back with fury? Or would she take the insult and let it scar her reputation? No one knew. That's why no one dared to look away. And in that quiet tension, one thought pulsed through the room like a heartbeat. Richard Posner thought he had defined her. But what Jasmine was about to do would redefine him and the entire confrontation, because no one was prepared for what she would do next. To understand why this clash reverberated far beyond that chamber, you have to see the contrast. On one side stood Richard Posner, a name etched into decades of legal tradition. To his admirers, he was sharp, uncompromising, a man who wielded the law like a weapon and rarely missed his target. But to his critics, his brilliance was clouded by arrogance, by a habit of dismissing those he deemed unworthy, as though their voices had no place in the halls of power. For Posner, courtroom battles were not just about justice, they were about hierarchy. And in his hierarchy, someone like Jasmine Crockett was supposed to stay near the bottom. But Jasmine Crockett had never been one to follow scripts written by others. Her career was built on refusing to stay quiet, on showing up where no one expected her to win, and then winning anyway. Case by case, district by district, she was earning a reputation as a relentless fighter for communities often overlooked. While Posner leaned on his prestige, Crockett leaned on people. The immigrant worker who needed representation, the single mother fighting eviction, the marginalized voice pushed aside until someone like her picked up the brief and said, "No, you deserve your day in court." That was the clash. It wasn't just 2 lawyers sparring. It was 2 worlds colliding. One built on old authority, on titles and tenure. The other built on lived struggle, resilience, and a growing movement for dignity in a system that too often denied it. So when Posner spat out the words, "fake lawyer," it wasn't only an insult to Jasmine. It was a shot at every underdog who had ever been told they weren't qualified. Every immigrant child who had ever been laughed at for daring to dream. Every young attorney who carried the weight of their entire community on their back. His insult carried more than condescension. It carried history. And that's why the room felt different. That's why the cameras didn't blink. Everyone sensed that this was more than a professional jab. This was generational, cultural, symbolic. Because what would happen if Jasmine Crockett backed down? If she stayed silent? If she let the word fake define her? Posner would walk away vindicated, arrogance preserved. And every young person watching who had ever been doubted would absorb the message, "Stay in your lane." But Jasmine wasn't built for silence. Her record proved it. Real victories, real clients, real justice delivered. And as whispers began to circulate through the gallery, as Twitter feeds lit up with fragments of the exchange, the stakes became undeniable. This wasn't about one courtroom moment anymore. This was about whether truth could still cut through the fog of arrogance. Because what happened next didn't just silence a judge, it made history. For decades, Richard Posner occupied rarefied air in the American legal system. To law students, his name appeared in casebooks as if etched in stone. To clerks, he was a towering intellect, someone whose opinions could shape entire branches of jurisprudence. He carried himself as the ultimate arbiter of logic, a man whose sharp pen and sharp tongue often left others scrambling to keep up. To many, Posner was not just a judge. He was the judge, the embodiment of authority clothed in the black robe. But prestige is a double-edged sword, and Posner wielded it with a bite. His reputation was not only built on brilliance, but also on a streak of dismissiveness that had become legend in courtrooms and conferences alike. Attorneys would whisper about the sting of his rebukes, the way he could cut down an argument not only on its merits but on its messenger. He didn't just refute, he belittled. He didn't just challenge, he mocked. And in those moments, you could see it. The flicker of arrogance that transformed intellectual sharpness into condescension. There were stories, passed around like cautionary tales. The young lawyer who presented a carefully prepared brief, only to be waved off with a snide comment. The academic who spent years building a theory, only for Posner to shrug and call it nonsense. To some, these anecdotes were proof of his brilliance, a reminder that he saw through weak arguments faster than anyone else. But to others, they revealed something darker, a habit of treating people as disposable, of confusing humiliation with persuasion. Over time, that arrogance became a signature. It was Posner's way of maintaining distance between himself and those he considered beneath him. He had authority, he had intellect, and he knew it, perhaps too well. And while that confidence kept him at the top for years, it also blinded him. He believed the weight of his words was enough to end any debate, to silence any challenger. That's why the insult toward Jasmine Crockett carried such venom. It wasn't the first time he had dismissed someone. It wasn't even the harshest thing he'd ever said, but it was revealing. By calling her a fake lawyer, Posner exposed the contradiction at the heart of his legacy, a man who claimed to serve the law while too often elevating his ego above it. Because Crockett was not fake, was real in every sense, real clients, real battles, real victories. And unlike many who wilted under Posner's sarcasm, she had already been hardened by a lifetime of proving herself. Where others bent, she had learned to rise. Where others fell silent, she had discovered the power of answering back, not with noise, but with undeniable truth. Yet Posner could not see that. His arrogance created blind spots, and in those blind spots lay the seeds of his downfall. He mistook Crockett for another easy target, another lawyer who would fumble under the weight of his reputation. He failed to recognize that times were changing, that authority itself was being questioned, and that figures like Jasmine represented a rising generation unwilling to accept dismissal as destiny. The irony is that Posner's greatest strength, his fearlessness in saying what others would not, became his greatest weakness in this moment. He had grown so accustomed to domination that he no longer measured his words. He believed that his insult would linger as fact. He believed that the chamber, the press, and the public would side with him, as they always had. But arrogance clouds judgment, and judgment, when clouded, creates cracks. In the silence that followed his insult, the cracks were visible. Some in the crowd exchanged uneasy glances. Others wondered whether Posner had gone too far. His attempt at control had slipped into pettiness, and pettiness does not command respect. The aura of invincibility that surrounded him began to thin, if only slightly, revealing the fragility beneath. That was the moment of foreshadowing. Because as much as Posner believed he had defined Jasmine Crockett, it would soon become clear that he had miscalculated. She was not the type to be erased with a phrase. She was the type to take an insult and turn it into fuel. And as the chamber braced for her response, one truth was already emerging. Arrogance may silence some voices, but it could never silence hers. And soon, Richard Posner would discover just how costly that arrogance could be. Long before she ever stepped into a courtroom, Jasmine Crockett understood what it meant to fight uphill battles. She wasn't born into prestige. There were no silver spoons, no ivy-covered walls waiting to usher her into the halls of power. Her story began far from the comfortable corridors that men like Richard Posner took for granted. Jasmine's beginnings were marked by grit, sacrifice, and an early lesson that if she wanted a seat at the table, she would have to build it herself. Her childhood was shaped by the rhythms of working-class life, a world where resources were scarce, but determination ran deep. She saw family members work long hours just to keep the lights on, neighbors share what little they had with those who had even less, and entire communities survive not through privilege, but through resilience. Those lessons weren't abstract. They were lived, daily reminders that dignity wasn't something granted from above. It was something earned through endurance. When Jasmine spoke about becoming a lawyer, some laughed. Others raised their eyebrows. The barriers were obvious: financial constraints, the weight of being underestimated, the ever-present shadow of doubt cast on young women, especially women of color, who dared to enter fields dominated by older, whiter, louder voices. But the doubt only strengthened her resolve. She wasn't running toward law because it was easy. She was running toward it because she knew people like her needed someone on the inside. Law school was no red carpet. It was sleepless nights, double shifts, and the heavy burden of proving herself over and over. Jasmine didn't just have to master the law, she had to survive the sneers, the backhanded compliments, the professors and classmates who questioned whether she truly belonged. Yet with every exam passed, every paper written, every case studied, she built armor, not to harden her heart, but to steel her spirit against a system that had never been built with her in mind. Her early career mirrored those struggles. She didn't walk into cushy offices with views of skyscrapers. She walked into courtrooms representing clients who couldn't afford anyone else. She fought eviction notices, challenged unfair prosecutions, defended the overlooked and the discarded. Each case felt less like a job and more like a mission, proof that the law wasn't the exclusive tool of the privileged. In her hands, it became a shield for the vulnerable, a voice for those who had been silenced. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was transformative. Word spread about the lawyer who refused to back down, who showed up prepared, who didn't care if the opponent was a local landlord or a corporate attorney with limitless resources. Jasmine knew the sting of being underestimated, and she refused to let her clients suffer the same fate. The victories piled up slowly at first. A family kept in their home, a worker reinstated after an unjust firing, charges dropped against someone who had been targeted because of who they were. Each win was more than just a legal decision. It was a reminder to her community that they mattered, that justice wasn't reserved for the powerful. And each loss, though painful, sharpened her resolve, teaching her how to fight smarter, harder, better. But beyond the court filings and legal arguments, what truly defined Jasmine was her authenticity. She didn't hide where she came from. She didn't pretend to be molded in the image of traditional power. She embraced her roots, her accent, her identity, and her people. That's why clients trusted her. That's why communities embraced her. She wasn't a symbol of a distant dream. She was proof that their struggles could translate into victory if someone dared to stand with them. Her rise wasn't meteoric, but it was undeniable. By the time she crossed paths with figures like Richard Posner, Jasmine had already become more than just a lawyer. She was a force. She carried the scars of her journey not as burdens, but as emblems of survival. Every courtroom she entered, she brought with her not only her own story, but the stories of hundreds who had leaned on her courage. And so, when Posner sneered "fake lawyer," those who knew Jasmine laughed at the absurdity. There was nothing fake about the woman who had clawed her way into the legal system and carved out space for her people. Nothing fake about the lawyer whose hands had lifted families out of despair. Nothing fake about the advocate who had made the powerful nervous simply by refusing to yield. What Posner couldn't see, what arrogance blinded him from recognizing, was that Jasmine Crockett was not just another lawyer. She was the culmination of years of struggle, a living rebuke to the system that had tried and failed to break her. Every rejection she endured, every door slammed in her face, every late night spent proving she belonged. It had all been training. Every case she fought, every client she defended, every insult she endured, it had all been preparation, because every case, every fight, had been preparing her for this exact moment. The silence that followed Posner's insult lingered like smoke in the air. But he wasn't finished. He leaned back in his chair, a smirk tugging at the corners of his mouth, as if daring anyone in the chamber to challenge him. His voice cut through the tension once again, colder this time, more deliberate. "You can stack up as many community Cases as you want, Ms. Crockett, he said. But the truth is, real lawyers earn their stripes in battles that matter, not in charity work masquerading as law. Gasps echoed again. Some shook their heads, stunned at the audacity. Others nodded along, comforted by the familiarity of authority reaffirming itself. Posner's tone carried the weight of someone who had always assumed his words could define reality. He wasn't just dismissing Jasmine's career. He was attempting to relegate it to the sidelines, to strip it of legitimacy in front of everyone watching. But Jasmine did not rise to his bait. She didn't snap back with outrage. She didn't roll her eyes or throw her hands in exasperation. Instead, she held his gaze with an almost unnerving calm. That composure, that unshaken stillness, became its own rebuttal. The more Posner attacked, the more obvious it became. The venom was his, not hers. Charity work? She repeated softly, almost to herself, her tone level, her expression unflinching. She didn't need to shout. She didn't need to perform. The repetition alone carried the weight of challenge, a mirror reflecting his words back at him. And yet, Posner pressed forward, doubling down. Yes, charity, symbolism, theater. You win small cases that make headlines but don't change the system. You give speeches, you rally crowds, but that doesn't make you a real lawyer. It makes you an activist in a robe. The audience shifted uncomfortably. Even those sympathetic to him felt the sharpness of his words, the bitterness bleeding through. A murmur began to ripple across the room, as if the crowd itself was struggling to decide which way the wind was blowing. Was Posner reasserting dominance, or was he revealing something less flattering? Desperation hidden beneath the arrogance? All the while, Jasmine remained steady. She didn't flinch. She didn't allow her posture to betray irritation. Instead, she listened, nodding slowly, as if cataloging every barb, every dismissal. Her silence spoke louder than rebuttals ever could. It suggested confidence, patience, and a quiet promise that she would not be defined by his insult, but by her own truth. The tension in the chamber thickened with every passing second. Journalists scribbled furiously, eyes darting between the two. Some audience members whispered under their breath. Others sat frozen, caught between outrage and anticipation. Who would land the decisive blow? Who would claim the moment as theirs? Posner mistook her silence for weakness. He chuckled under his breath and leaned in closer, his voice dripping with condescension. One day, he sneered, you'll understand that the law is about more than passion. It's about power. And power doesn't come from community handouts. It comes from being taken seriously. Something you've never managed to earn. A hush fell over the room. The line cut deeper than any before it. For a split second, it seemed as though Posner had seized control again, pulling the chamber back into his orbit. His words hung heavy, daring Jasmine to finally crack, daring her to lash out and confirm his caricature. But she didn't. Instead, Jasmine exhaled slowly, her eyes never leaving his. Calm, centered, unshaken. And in that moment, her stillness became electrifying. The audience leaned forward in unison, drawn into the tension like spectators at the edge of a cliff. And then, Crockett leaned forward. The room held its breath as Jasmine Crockett leaned forward, her hands resting lightly on the table before her. Her voice, when it came, was measured, not hurried, not shrill, but deliberate. Each syllable landed with the precision of a hammer, striking iron. You call me a fake lawyer, she began, her eyes locked on Posner. But facts don't bend to insults. They tell their own story, and mine is written in victories you can't erase. The murmurs in the crowd stilled instantly. Every head turned toward her, waiting, sensing the shift. This was no longer a defense. This was an indictment. She paused, letting the silence stretch. Then, with the calm of someone who knew the weight of truth was on her side, she began her catalog. The Johnson eviction case, she said. A mother of 3, forced out illegally by a landlord who thought she couldn't fight back. I fought for her. We won. She kept her home. A ripple of acknowledgement swept through the room. Some nodded. Some whispered the name as though recalling headlines they had once skimmed. The Diaz workplace case, she continued. A man fired for speaking up against unsafe conditions. Management told him he had no rights. I told him he did. And the court agreed. He got his job back, and so did dozens of others who had been too afraid to come forward. Gasps this time. Louder, more audible. The chamber was no longer neutral ground. It was shifting beneath their feet. And then, she said, her voice tightening with intensity, the Harris County prosecution. They thought a young black man with no resources would plead guilty to something he didn't do. I said no. I stood up. I brought evidence they overlooked, or maybe ignored. The case collapsed. He walked free. His life, stolen by the system, was returned. The silence after that victory echoed louder than the gasp before it. Even Posner blinked, his smirk faltering just slightly, as though the ground under his certainty had cracked. Jasmine leaned back slightly, as though giving the weight of her words room to settle. "Fake lawyer?" she said again, this time with a soft laugh. "Real families, real workers, real freedom. Those aren't fantasies. Those aren't speeches. Those are victories. In courtrooms where the only thing that matters is evidence, skill, and the courage to keep fighting." The audience erupted in whispers. Reporters scribbled furiously. Cameras zoomed in, capturing the flicker of doubt that had crossed Posner's face. But Jasmine wasn't finished. "You talk about power," she said, her voice sharpening now. "You think it's about titles, tenure, prestige. But power isn't about the robe you wear or the building you sit in. Power is about impact. It's about the lives you change when you stand up and refuse to let arrogance trample truth." Her rhythm grew, not rushed but intentional, each example another nail in the coffin of his insult. "You call my work charity. Let me tell you what charity looks like. A system that only serves the privileged. What I do is justice, and justice is never fake." The words landed like blows, each one striking harder than the last. The chamber began to tilt unmistakably toward her, the crowd leaning in, the murmurs turning to low affirmations. The energy belonged to Jasmine now. She let the pause linger again, her eyes scanning the room before returning to Posner. "Do you know what's really fake?" she asked, voice steady but cutting. "Pretending that a legacy of arrogance is the same thing as justice. Pretending that dismissing people makes you right. Pretending that your power matters more than the people you serve. That's what's fake." The chamber trembled. A few gasps, a few muffled exclamations. Even those who had long admired Posner could not deny it. The balance had shifted. His silence was louder than his insults now. Jasmine leaned in once more, her final strike prepared, her tone calm but laced with undeniable fire. "So the next time you call me a fake lawyer, remember this. My victories speak louder than your insults. My clients' lives are the proof, and no matter how many words you throw, you cannot silence what I've already done. I don't need your validation. The truth has already spoken." The chamber erupted. Applause burst from sections that had tried to remain neutral. Others sat stunned, unable to deny the transformation unfolding before them. The image of Posner, the man untouchable, unimpeachable, shrank beneath the weight of her words. His mouth opened as if to reply, but no sound came. His silence was the most powerful admission of all. Jasmine did not bask. She didn't raise her voice to ride the applause. She simply sat back, folded her hands, and let the room absorb what had just happened. It was not just a rebuttal. It was a mic drop, a moment so definitive, so devastating, that the insult that had begun it all now sounded ridiculous, hollow, empty, and the world outside that chamber had not even heard it yet. When they did, the shockwaves would stretch far beyond those four walls. The moment Jasmine Crockett delivered her final line, the chamber was no longer a courtroom. It was a stage where history had just unfolded. Reporters bolted for the exits, clutching notebooks filled with fragments of phrases that would soon dominate headlines. Phones lit up like fireworks, texts flying, tweets drafted at lightning speed. Before Posner could even gather himself, the world outside had already seized on what had happened. The first clips appeared on social media within minutes. Grainy phone footage of Jasmine's calm voice delivering, "My victories speak louder than your insults," went viral almost instantly. On Twitter, a hashtag surged, "Real lawyer," then another, "Crockett crushes Posner." By the end of the day, both were trending nationally. Memes followed. One showed Posner leaning forward with the caption, "Fake lawyer." Below it, Jasmine's calm stare, captioned, "Fake victories don't exist." Another meme featured her words plastered over her image in bold type. Justice is never fake. Instagram feeds flooded with the clip. TikTok users remixed it with music, turning her rebuttal into a viral anthem. The headlines were just as relentless. Crockett shuts down Posner in courtroom showdown. Fake lawyer, her wins prove otherwise. Power versus people, Crockett turns insult into triumph. Cable news ran the footage on repeat, each network framing it differently, but all agreeing that Posner had been left speechless in the moment he least expected. Commentators weighed in, some gleeful, others stunned. Progressive analysts called it a masterclass in composure under fire. Even skeptics admitted that her calm dismantling of Posner's insult was nothing short of surgical. Rival attorneys, long hesitant to praise her openly, conceded on air that her courtroom track record was undeniable. One conservative commentator, visibly rattled, muttered, "I may not like her politics, but that was devastating." But perhaps the most powerful reactions came from ordinary people watching at home. Tweets poured in from young law students. "If Jasmine Crockett can stand up to Posner, I can survive finals." Immigrant parents shared the clip with their children, captions reading, "This is why we fight. This is why you don't give up." Workers reposted her victories, connecting her courtroom wins to their own struggles. She had become more than a lawyer in that moment. She had become a symbol. And the ripple effects didn't stop at social media. Politicians took notice. A senator tweeted, "The law is stronger when fighters like Jasmine Crockett refuse to be silenced." Activists began citing her words at rallies. Even celebrities weighed in. An actor posted the clip with the caption, "Mic dropped, respect." Overnight, Crockett's name was everywhere. For Posner, the silence became deafening. His allies tried to spin the moment, claiming he had been taken out of context, but the footage told the story better than any statement could. Every time he or his defenders spoke, the video replayed, and each replay made his insult sound pettier, more outdated, more fragile. He had meant to define Jasmine, but instead, he had redefined himself in the eyes of the public, not the towering figure of authority, but the symbol of arrogance toppled by truth, and the numbers told the rest. By the end of the week, clips of Jasmine's response had racked up millions of views across platforms. Editorials praised her poise, podcasts replayed her cadence, and grassroots groups used her words as rallying cries. She wasn't just trending, she was resonating. Because one courtroom moment had become something bigger. It had become a national turning point. A moment where authority was questioned, where arrogance was unmasked, where a woman who had clawed her way up from humble beginnings proved that legitimacy isn't granted from above. It's earned through real victories. And if that single moment could ripple across the country in hours, the question wasn't whether Jasmine Crockett would rise further. The question was, how far could she go? When the storm of headlines and reactions finally began to settle, Jasmine Crockett did not bask in the glow of her newfound spotlight. She stood at a podium days later, her voice steady but warm, carrying the weight of a lesson that stretched far beyond one courtroom exchange. "Titles don't define a lawyer," she began, her words echoing in a hall packed with supporters and reporters alike. "Service does. Results do. The people we fight for, they're the real measure of our work." She could have made the moment about her clash with Posner, about winning a public duel against one of the most recognized judicial figures of the modern era. But instead, she turned the insult that had been hurled at her into a truth that belonged to everyone who had ever been dismissed, underestimated, or belittled. "You can call me a fake," she said, pausing for a beat. "But what you can't fake are the families I've defended, the lives I've impacted, the victories I've earned for those who had nowhere else to turn. And that truth will always be louder than arrogance." The crowd erupted, but she raised a hand gently, calming them, her eyes sweeping across the room. "Because this moment isn't about me. It's about all of us. About what happens when someone tries to erase our work with a word. About what happens when those who think they own power try to dismiss those who earned it. We don't crumble, we rise." Her message carried a universal clarity. What mattered wasn't the insult, but the response. What mattered wasn't the title one carried, but the proof of work, the authenticity of results. She reframed the narrative. Posner's arrogance had tried to reduce her identity to a label, but her victories, lived and undeniable, had already written a different story, one that no insult could erase. Truth outlasts lies, she continued. Dignity outshines arrogance, and service to others will always carry more weight than self-importance. In that moment, she wasn't just speaking as a lawyer. She was speaking as a daughter of struggle, as a representative of every immigrant family who fought for a foothold, as a symbol for anyone told they weren't enough. Her words weren't lofty abstractions. They were grounded in lived proof. In cases won, injustice served. The room grew still, people leaning forward, the power of her cadence holding them in place. And as she brought her message to its crescendo, she gave the audience something more than a courtroom victory. She gave them a roadmap for resilience. Don't let anyone tell you your service doesn't matter, she said. Don't let arrogance disguise itself as authority. Your work, your dignity, your truth, that is real. And nothing, not even the loudest insult, can erase it. The applause this time wasn't just celebration, it was release. It was people recognizing themselves in her journey. It was workers, students, parents, and dreamers seeing their own dignity validated. For Jasmine Crockett, the insult had been a spark, but the lesson became the flame. Arrogance can shout, but truth endures. And in a country where power so often tries to belittle those who rise from the margins, her story reminded millions that authenticity isn't granted, it's proven. The insult may have been Posner's, but the victory, and the moral that outlasted it, belonged to Jasmine, and to everyone who knew what it meant to fight for recognition, for dignity, for justice. And yet, even in this moment of resolution, one question lingered like a charged silence. If one courtroom showdown could ignite a national wave, what could happen if millions stood up with the same courage? She had been called a fake lawyer. That insult, meant to diminish her, had echoed for only a moment. But her victories, undeniable, hard-earned, etched in the lives of those she defended, spoke louder than any word Richard Posner could ever utter. And in the silence that followed his failed attack, the truth became impossible to ignore. Arrogance fades, but dignity endures. This was never just about one courtroom. It was about the larger battle playing out in America, between those who cling to power through mockery and dismissal, and those who earn respect through service and resilience. Jasmine Crockett showed us which side of that battle history will remember. Not the arrogance of insults, but the courage of results. Not the false superiority of titles, but the authenticity of justice delivered. And here's the lesson for all of us. When someone tries to erase your worth with a word, let your work, your truth, and your victories answer back. Because no insult can outlast proof. No arrogance can silence dignity. No lie can eclipse truth. If Jasmine Crockett's story moved you, if her resilience reminded you of your own fight, then don't let this moment fade. Stand with voices like hers. Subscribe to this channel, share this story, and be part of a movement that says, arrogance may shout, but truth echoes forever. Because in the end, this wasn't just a courtroom clash. It was a reminder for every immigrant, every worker, every dreamer, every believer in justice, that authenticity is never fake. It is real. It is powerful. And when it rises, no insult in the world can silence it.